Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're basically setting up the detective's corkboard. We are going to unpack a highly charged, really widely circulated geopolitical theory that just recently surfaced. Now, this source material weaves together everything from recent assassination attempts to historical royal diplomacy and even century-old political murders. And look, whether you buy into this theory or not, the way the creator connects these seemingly random dots is absolutely fascinating to break down. So we're going to look strictly at the evidence the source presents, map out their exact logic, and explain how this modern geopolitical theory is constructed. All right, let's dive right in. Here's a quick look at our roadmap. We're going to cover the assassination theory, a crazy 125-year parallel, the perceived threat to the empire, the weapon of soft power, and finally, a really revealing House of Lords report. Let's get to it. Section 1. The assassination theory, connecting the Washington Hilton to the monarchy.
So this theory actually kicks off with a really wild geographical echo. The recent third assassination attempt on Donald Trump happened at the Washington Hilton. That is the exact same hotel where President Ronald Reagan was shot 45 years ago. The architects of this narrative actually used Trump's own reaction to anchor their whole premise. The most impactful people, they're the ones that they go after. The argument they're making here is that he isn't being targeted just because of inflammatory rhetoric, but because he's actively dismantling a deeply entrenched system of global power.
3. That is the number of assassination attempts on Donald Trump in under 2 years. Butler, Pennsylvania, Palm Beach, Florida, and now the Washington Hilton. For the people building this theory, this unprecedented density of attacks is the ultimate catalyst. It's basically a flashing red light that prompts their search for what they call a hidden hand. They argue that this level of sustained, repeated threat goes way beyond individual lone wolves and actually points toward a highly coordinated effort by a threatened establishment. Think about how we usually scroll through the news. You probably saw these as 3 totally separate headlines, all happening during the exact same week of that Washington Hilton attempt. First, King Charles arrives in Washington. Second, a new book drops, all about the Queen's hidden political influence. And third, a Chatham House report comes out expressing total panic over the international order. But this theory argues they aren't isolated at all. They're intimately connected, coordinated reactions by a British establishment that is scrambling to counter a direct threat.
Moving to Section 2, a 125-year parallel, the ghost of William McKinley.
To figure out the present, the source actually drags us back a full century to President William McKinley. The theory proposes that McKinley was the last president to genuinely threaten the British imperial system. How? By championing domestic industry, heavy tariffs, and an independent American system. And because Trump frequently references McKinley and has actively revived those exact same economic policies, the argument goes that both of these presidents posed existential economic threats to the British-led global architectures of their times.
Now, McKinley's assassination back in 1901, the source argues it wasn't just some isolated tragedy. It was actually the culmination of a terrifying global wave of assassinations. I mean, look at this. Between 1894 and 1901, the leaders of France, Spain, Austria, and Italy were all murdered by anarchists. The explosive claim made by the source here is that Great Britain was actually notorious during this era for safe housing these exact anarchist movements. The implication is that a hidden hand was using these constructed climates of hatred to eliminate leaders who threatened their imperial dominance. A tactic that theory suggests is absolutely being deployed once again.
Which brings us to Section 3, threatening the empire, dismantling the post-war order. So, if there really is a hidden hand, what's the motive, right? What is actually provoking this massive backlash? Well, the theory claims that in 125 years, literally no president has systematically dismantled the imperial architecture quite like this, throwing free trade out the window, rattling the Federal Reserve's independence, threatening to cut off strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, dismantling London's shipping insurance monopolies, going after offshore dark money, and even threatening the very existence of NATO. To the proponents of this theory, this isn't just a casual policy disagreement. It is the systematic destruction of the modern British Empire's most crucial economic and strategic levers.
Section 4, the weapon of soft power, 70 years of intelligence and influence.
Look, we usually picture the British monarchy as, purely ceremonial, just figureheads cutting ribbons. But this theory pivots sharply away from that idea, and it roots its argument in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Back then, when Britain and France tried to seize the Suez Canal, U.S. President Eisenhower basically threatened to crash the British pound if they didn't stop immediately. And well, they stopped. The theory pinpoints this as the exact moment Britain realized they no longer had independent military dominance. From that day forward, the empire had to rely on manipulating American power instead of wielding its own, using their ultimate weapon, royal soft power. The narrative draws a massive contrast between this covert soft power and Trump's overt hard power.
For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth wasn't just waving from a balcony. She was receiving daily top-secret intelligence briefings, deeply involved in nuclear contingency plans, and utilizing her quiet, personal charm to meticulously steer U.S. policy. Trump, on the other hand, is framed as this blunt force disruption. He leverages aggressive tariffs, completely defies diplomatic norms, and famously broke royal etiquette by literally walking ahead of the Queen.
And the source cites a really specific historical anecdote here to show that the establishment's reaction to this disruption wasn't purely symbolic. Take Queen Elizabeth wearing a very specific brooch on the day of Donald Trump's arrival in the UK. It was actually a gift from Michelle Obama, and the Queen hadn't worn it in public for 7 years. According to the theory, this wasn't just a petty fashion choice. It was described as a silent act of resistance, a deeply political insult and a crystal-clear signal that the soft power establishment was entirely rejecting as disruption.
Finally, Section 5. The House of Lords. Panic over the rules-based order.
The theory argues that right now, this soft power is actively failing, and they point to concrete documentation claiming the British establishment is in an absolute state of panic. It all comes down to a brand new report released by the British House of Lords International Relations and Defence Committee, which was presented at the Chatham House think tank. Even the title itself, Adjusting to New Realities, Rebalancing the UK-US Partnership, is flagged by the source as highly significant, especially given the timing of the assassination attempts and the current U.S. election cycle.
Let's look at the actual words here from Lord Robertson, a former NATO General Secretary who chaired this committee. He stated that the post-World War II rules-based international order has suited us well, but then he notes that increasingly Americans are taking a different view. The theory basically pounces on this phrase. They interpret "suited us well" as a massive, glaring understatement. They read it as an outright admission that the entire British system is utterly reliant on U.S. compliance just to survive.
And the personnel behind this report? It's honestly got this deep, cinematic irony to it that the theory loves pointing out. One of the key architects is Lord Kim Darroch. During Trump's first term, Darroch was the British ambassador to Washington. That is, until his secret cables calling the administration inept were leaked, which forced him to resign. But he was elevated to the House of Lords just 4 months later. So the very man whose career was derailed by Trump is now drafting the UK's strategy for dealing with his potential return.
Then the narrative drops what it considers the ultimate smoking gun. It's this final quote from the House of Lords report, courtesy of Lord MacDonald. On the international stage, there is no effective enforcement without the United States. For the proponents of this theory, this is it. It's an open, documented admission by the British establishment that if Donald Trump successfully abandons their global architecture and fully returns to an independent American system, the modern British Empire is effectively over. Without American enforcement, their power simply evaporates.
So, that leaves us with this final, honestly chilling question posed by the source material. They argue that this House of Lords report reveals a deep existential fear. A fear that if Trump gets just 2 more years to consolidate these changes, the dismantling of their imperial order will be completely irreversible. They're basically racing the clock. So if we follow the theory's logic to its absolute limit, if a hidden hand truly exists and their entire global existence is on the line, how far would they go to stop him? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this breakdown helped you see exactly how these complex, incredibly high-stakes geopolitical arguments are constructed. See you next time.